Okay, this is second attempt of this video because the first time the battery ran out. Ever professional. This is a 1986 Sessionette 75 guitar amplifier chassis. Built with some 1985 parts but signed off 1986. British built, hand built. This is the second repair that I've done on this. Christmas 2016, I believe it was. I was booked in with a recording session with the guy who owns this, and it broke down just before we started. Obviously at Christmas the most difficult thing to do is to get parts in the post, so we didn't have a lot of time for diagnosis. What we ended up doing is just blanket buying as many basic parts as we could and hopefully putting something in that would fix it in time, and we got lucky. It turned out to be the TL071 input buffer op amp that was faulty. But what we ended up doing as a precaution was changing all of the other op amps, which are TL072s, and I did change one input capacitor because they're so low value, they were difficult to actually test, so just as a precaution I did change this capacitor. It's mostly made of British and Japanese parts, Debilia capacitors and Texas op amps, Philips film capacitors, and mostly sort of Cliff and Switchcraft and Omeg pots and switches, I believe. There's a bit of a stigma around these that the best thing to do if they break down was always to send them to the original manufacturer, which is a bit odd because there's absolutely nothing exotic in these and they're not difficult to work on. As I say, they're hand built. The most difficult thing is getting the board loose because it's anchored at the front by all the pots and then 3 anchor points on the board itself, but this is all hand soldered wire, so you have to cut a lot of cable ties and that kind of thing if you want to try and work it loose, and then remove the input jack as well. But I've heard some pretty dodgy stories about these being sent to the company as it is now, awards session. What's also unusual is that an entire PDF of the schematics and service data is freely available on their own website. This has come from the awards session site. This is a schematic of just the preamp and power supply assembly. The power amp is on a separate schematic. The power amps can be notorious for failing on them, and awards session do actually make an entire drop-in unit that replaces it with a different topology. But on this one, the power amp's fine. Now, what caused the problems? The first time this broke down, the owner told me that on a rush to get to a rehearsal, he clonked the amp against the bumper of his car quite hard. Then when he got to the rehearsal, it didn't work. Strangely, exactly the same thing happened this time. But what I think may have been the cause was that in a rush to get this ready for our Christmas session at the time, we noticed that the anchor points, which I think were sticky plastic pads at the time, were completely missing or corroded. Someone must have been in this before. I think the original dates on the op amps that were in it were 1994, 5, something like that. So someone had been in it and serviced it at the time. In a rush to get it up and running, we never actually solved the problem with the anchor points, so we didn't anchor the board down. So it was just bolted in by the pots at the front, and it was flapping in the breeze, and we completely forgot about it. So what I've done this time is bolt on some nylon fasteners and standoffs that will go and anchor it down into the bottom of the chassis there. Another part of the repair I did, the fuse clips. There are 2 fuses for either side of the secondary of the transformer. One was completely missing. One of the fuse clips had just snapped completely and it was just corroded and rusted. So it was only running on one half of the secondary of the transformer, which made it hum like crazy because it was only operating as a half-wave rectifier, not a full-wave rectifier. So one of the first jobs to do was replace the fuse clips with some brand new ones, get new fuses in there, and then that solved a lot of the hum problems. All the capacitors are absolutely fine. They're really good quality, all tested completely solid, no problems there at all. Another thing, and this is a thing that guitarists tend to do, is I could go in and change anything on this, but crucially he doesn't want to change the sound of the amp. So we only want to fix the faults. We don't want to blanket recap it or anything like that. 1, there's no need, and 2, that wasn't what was desired. A couple of the pots are a little bit rusty on the backing places, but they've all been sprayed out. They're all original, all 1985 stamped. and they all pretty much work, so I've no need to do anything there. But I'd just like to go over a couple of points on these in case anyone's got one and is stuck in a bit of a mystery as to what's wrong with it. First of all, let's start at the beginning. The input is buffered by a TL071 op-amp. The following TL072s operate the gain stage, active EQ, and return from the reverb. You can buy these in packs of 5, or however many you want, for peanuts, for a couple of pounds. So they're very easy. They're all socketed as well, so they're very easy to change as long as you're careful with the pins and you get them in the right way around. One of the sockets on this one I have changed for a good quality turn pin socket. This TL071, which could have been the cause of the problem, I noticed the socket was very sloppy and a little bit corroded. So I've changed that for a nice quality turn pin socket. Again, you can buy them in packs of 5 for a couple of pounds. They're dirt cheap. So if you have any problems in the preamp section, definitely look at those. Very quick thing to add, I forgot to mention. Check the switching in some of the jack sockets. If you have any problem with having no sound at all, what you can do is you can directly inject into the power amp. There's a power amp input on the back. If you inject a low level line signal, you can test the power amp. I tested it with an output from a computer, just playing an audio file, and just gently brought the volume up, and the power amp output was clean and worked fine. So that's how I knew that there was a fault in the preamp, not the power amp. So if you've got a kind of switch cleaner, check the pots and check the contacts, especially the power amp input and the send and return jacks on the back of this. Another thing, quite a common problem, is that the reverb doesn't work. Now, a very common cause is the phono sockets. On a lot of these look like they might have been changed at some point. Of course, they're very, very simple to terminate and change. If they're corroded, or if they're in the tank the wrong way around, they may cause a problem. Another problem you may have is the discrete transistor. There's a Motorola transistor here that drives the reverb tank. There's also a power resistor here, quite a big power resistor, that drops the positive rail to this, and there's a smaller resistor that drops the negative rail. So they're always worth checking if you have no reverb drive. If you have no reverb return, I think it might be this one of the op amps, it comes back in. The 3 little purple capacitors, if you can see those there, they're the bypass capacitors for each gain stage from the op amps. If any of those are open, or even if any of them are shorted, I think it'd be unlikely that they would short, but if any are open, the signal won't pass through to the next stage. If any of them are short, you may get a DC offset, which can damage the op amps and it can damage the power amp. I've read on a forum somewhere that there's a resistor R9 on the power amp board which is prone to going high, and this can upset the bias, I think it is, on the power transistors. They're a Hitachi power transistor which is out of stock now. It doesn't exist anymore. So my thought behind this was we need to be kind to these. We need to make sure that there are no problems in the preamp that are causing any stress on these. But I have checked R9 on this and it's well within tolerance. Some have recommended that you change it for a higher rated resistor, but on this one I find no sign of trouble with it at all. The power is divided down by a couple of Zener diodes here. We have a 16 volt plus and minus supply, as we can see on the schematic. There's our plus and there's our minus. We have 2 main filter capacitors, which are the big ones here, and then 2 smaller filter capacitors, which are the smaller ones here. So they're worth a check. There's also a couple of 3 watt power droppers, power dropping resistors, 680 ohm, so that's R32, R33, which are there, which will be 3 watt wire wound. Again, they're solid as a rock, but if you have any problem, well worth a check. If you have excessive humming, check each fuse. If one of the fuses is open, you'll only be running as a half-wave rectifier, so you will get a hum. And of course general maintenance, things like the switches, the pots, The switches, I believe, are sealed. They're a fairly standard fan heater style main switch, and then the main switch is a standard neon. So they're really easily replaceable with stock parts. And the pots are, I think, an OMEG design, but again, fairly standard. The soldering's really solid on them. One of the most difficult things to do with it, if you don't want to remove all of these cables, is get to the bottom of the board. It's quite difficult to work on, but I did just manage to get my iron in and get to the bottom of this socket and this capacitor to change it. But other than that, incredibly simple. So I just thought I'd share a few pointers there if anyone's got one and they're having any trouble with it. And what I'm going to do now is replace this resistor. That's another thing to mention, actually. This resistor in the original spec is 220k, I believe. 220 ohms. There is a revision of this. This is mentioned, here we go. This is mentioned in really tiny text on here. The R31 has been changed. R31 is there. R31 has been changed to a 470 ohm. And this one, you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but it looks pretty burnt up. This is the dropper resistor for the headphone output. If this were to short, it would short the power output directly to ground. So we'd have a problem there. I think it's more likely to go open, as you can see the state of it there. But that is an original 220. So I've got some, that's a 2 watt spec, but I've got some 3 watt 470s. So I'm going to change this as a matter of precaution. He never uses the headphone output, but if this shorts, we're going to have trouble. So that's going to be changed for a 470 to bring it up to the spec that's on the sheet there. And that's about it, I think. I hope that's of help to someone who's troubleshooting one of these. As I say, have a look on the awards session website. There's an entire PDF and really simple to work on. Cheers.